Okay, so with the picture, it's showing us a very important point that where we see something from, as well as how we're looking at it, dictates our perception. So, acknowledging ourselves. We're probably living in the most intense times in history. We really need to acknowledge this. We need to look after ourselves. Lots of TLC. Let's appreciate the fact we're still functioning. More importantly, we're working on solutions. Okay, and then once we put our attention there, as well as doing TLC, then I think we start to really find solutions. What we're facing is unfair, to be kind to ourselves. And what I mean by this is that if you have two people in a conversation, you have one person that's very aware, one person that's unaware. We are assuming we're the aware ones. So we're going out of our way to learn how to communicate with the other person. Okay, that in itself is unfair because the other person isn't going out their way. But this really is, I think, the better side to be on. I don't think any of us would swap sides to be unaware. Okay, we've got a response ability. So it's not like a weight on us, but it's an opportunity where we can really learn what's going on. So some presentation notes is today is a summary of how perception works and why it is the most important concept, in my opinion. We've got limited resources, basically on the project at the moment, which I think is about to change with a lot more people involved. But in this aspect, it's really substance over style. So you're not going to see too many bells and whistles today. And of course, the project has really taken off this week, but it's added a load of workload. But of course, our website's ground to a halt. And as I said, you know, we're going to have to make sure that we get the substance and not worry too much about the delivery. But today is going to be an important one. I mean, this really is so key. And I think anyone that really understands perception at a good level really knows how to be very effective at many things. So, of course, we talk about the apple juice. As it shakes up, everything looks a bit confusing. But once you relax, and later on, everything will start to settle and then things will make sense. So basically, relax, absorb. It's recorded. You can watch as many times as you wish. And obviously, you can reach out for questions. So what the project is, this really is a key point, because if we don't see it for what it is, then we're not going to use it correctly. It's a study of how to navigate a person's resistance and conditioning to have an open, honest, and two-way exchange of ideas and information. This is what we believe is the conditions for truth to arise. Now, at the moment, the conditions in most conversations are not for the truth to arise. The conditions are set for conflict, and that's been done purposely. So if we don't use this as the method, then we're just going to add to the conflict. So it really is not about us talking someone else into something, but us pointing at something very well. So what it is not is tools and techniques to get someone to see things our way. Because again, that's all what manipulation tends to be about, manipulating, coercing anyone to see things from our perspective. However, when you look at Zen masters and many people from the past, it was telling stories and information for the person to come to realizations within themselves. And I find that as I've really attempted to cultivate this mindset in myself, you reach people faster and more without trying to reach them. It's one of those things that once we release our attachment. So in summary, the truth is compelling enough that it stands on its own merits. We just have to point to it effectively. It is simple, but far from easy, and does require a lot of practice. But once you get it, then you learn some really good ways to communicate. So one of the first points that we really need to understand is that people confuse their perception with reality. The two things are very different, okay? And of course, it really is only reality that's the key to people. So perception and reality are two different things, okay? And what we believe, we see what we believe rather than what we see. And in today's world, this is really evident for so many of us. So a couple of examples of perception deceiving us. So what do we see here? Do you see a duck or do you see a rabbit? Okay, it really depends from perspective. Okay, now, does this look like the floor is collapsing in? Okay, this is just an illusion. Okay, But because the people that draw this understand the cues by which our visual perception works, they're able to provide an illusion, able to make something look like something other than it is. Bear that in mind, because that's a really important point. Now, the next one is a 30-second video. And I'm going to ask the question first, which square, A or B, is darker? Okay, so in our perception, in my perception, is telling me that A is darker than B. Okay, so let's just play, and you're going to see in a slow drag, so you're going to see A picked up along with B and dragged to one side. Okay, now when you first see that, you think, no, you must be changing it. Okay, so let's go into design view. Let's take the A, let's drag it over to A, and let's drag it down to B. Okay, our minds are changing that in real time, as hard as it is to believe. Now, the reason is that in our visual field, we have 3 cues. We have static cues, we have motion cues, and we have binocular cues. Because you think there's a shadow there, because we think this is a shadow, we lighten this. That makes sense? We're taking into consideration this. It's the same, we actually see the world in 2-dimensional. Our brain makes it 3-dimensional, and it uses certain cues to make it 3-dimensional. Okay, so just bear in mind that these are really fascinating when you start to look at these, and there's certain elements within them which, you know, the brain is trying to make sense of what's going on. So let's let you absorb that for a minute, because when I first saw that, I was like, this is just crazy. Okay. So the next thing to moving on is really to understand the map is not the territory. What do we mean by this? So Jane is not interacting with reality. She is interacting with her map of reality. So what she perceives reality to be. And as we just saw, sometimes our perception can deceive us. Yeah, and it can deceive us in real time. If someone knew the cues in which makes us see things a certain way, and then they presented things using those cues, as some government documents do, then people can actually see reality far different from it is. That makes sense? That's the real key point. We're always dealing with our perception of reality, not reality itself. So then the question is, what are the filters and the editing that goes on in real time to reality through our perception? So what we have is that we're always filtering information coming in due to the sheer amount. We have 2 billion bits of stimuli coming in at one moment. Have you ever been in a room, there'd be 3 conversations going on behind you, and then suddenly you hear your name? Okay, your brain's taking in all that information, but because your name is tagged as a cue, your consciousness goes, oh, that's what I need to know about. That makes sense? So that's the auditory cue, an auditory filter. If we're looking at things and then it's a bit like when you think about visual cues. Have you ever bought a new car, and then as you were driving around, you noticed how many of that car were on the road? Okay, again, the fact that you bought that car, now it's a cue for you, so now you notice that car. That makes sense? So that's a visual field. So us here on this call, and many other people that we're talking to at the moment, have managed to identify certain cues. For example, anything that comes from the BBC is probably in a certain category of trust, that are providing us false information, and we adjust accordingly. That makes sense? So that's what's really key, and that's the awareness, is to notice these filters in perception and these cues. And this really does explain why you are important, and explains why they go to such lengths to disfigure the argument that we're making. Okay. And that's in one of the cues that we'll look at later. But this is why a lot of people actually feel like they need to give up. But in fact, it's the opposite. It's double down. It's work out how to get information to people, because if they're trying to shut people down, there's a reason. If we weren't reaching people, they wouldn't care what we said. And this is a really key point. And we're not going to go into an extreme amount of depth today, but emotions distort the weighting of this information. So there was a story, I did a perception course recently, and it was brilliant. And the instructor was given an example where he was in Taiwan and he was walking through this nice park, and then he saw a sign that he worked out, a big sign of snakes, and then it had writing in foreign language, but he'd worked out that he now has to look out for snakes. As it turned out, he said at the end of his journey, he saw 20 snakes, okay? And 2 of them were real snakes, okay? Every branch he looked at was a snake so what happens is you have these 2 processes in the brain. One of them is this instant, let's make sense of this in a rough way. And then when you have a second or 2 to really focus in, then you sort of clarify whether you were correct. So of the 20 snakes he saw, 18 of them were not real snakes. They were branches that his mind had made them look about snakes in order to preserve his well-being. That makes sense? So this is the thing about cues, and this is how emotions, because he became obviously vigilant, he saw things more than he should have seen them. And if you think about, let's say there was a pathogen or something that was concerning people at the moment, if that was made to look like a lion when it wasn't a lion, you see how the emotions will, and that's why fear is one of the strongest emotions and will distort reality more than most of the other emotions that I see. And of course, anger, bitterness, all these emotions will distort our reality, which is why this is such a real good thing to do the EFT and other techniques. So on perception, I'm going to tell you a little story which was really fascinating. And so within perception itself, there's a thing called anchor bias, and there's lots of cognitive biases that we have, but anchor bias is really key. And what it says is that a lot of the time, the first information that we're exposed to often is the most important. And this is why they say first impressions are important. I actually don't think that's the case. I think they're really, really important. Okay, they're much more important than we think. Now, there's lots of studies that have been done on from a marketing perspective now, and they had an example that Cialdini in his new work, Persuasion, talks about. They had an online furniture store. They created 2 different front pages. One page had fluffy clouds in the background. The other page had little pennies in the background. But because it was the first window in, it was the first impression, what often is that it's like when you walk into a house, the door really starts to govern your mood. Those that went into the website with the fluffy clouds, they mostly bought soft furniture. Those that went in via the pennies, they bought economical furniture. The rest of their experience was clouded, pardon the pun, by the initial experience. Why is this so important to us? I'll give you one example that's so important. If the person you're talking to decides that you're an anti this or an anti that or a conspiracy theorist, do you know what happens to the rest of the conversation? It is dismissed, okay? Because how we operate in groups, and I'll just touch on this now, is that we organize ourselves into groups, and if a group is in opposition to our group, we dismiss everything they say, okay? So the effectiveness of the conspiracy theory label, etc., that if you consider yourself not a conspiracy theorist and you hear something from a conspiracy theorist, you're going to dismiss it. This is why they spend so much time, energy, resources creating that box. People will inadvertently step into that box. So the first hurdle in all of the work that we do, and I'd make sure I always do it when talking to someone, is I reverse that assumption. I basically show the person how it's not true. Identifying with labels is very problematic if that label describes a group. And of course, when it comes to the filtering of perception, there is this common belief with everyone that we're recording like a camera perception. It couldn't be further from the truth. We're editing in real time, okay? We're not just watching perception, we are watching our version of perception and we're editing it in real time. So then the question is, how do the filters get updated? Okay, so you've got reality, information comes into reality, it passes through our filters. So our cues, our belief systems, all the information we know. We edit it in real time. So for instance, if you're talking to someone and they think you're a conspiracy theorist, they're literally editing what you're saying. In fact, they're just deleting it, okay? if they think that's what you are. And then, of course, what happens is that there's a two-way exchange between the map, which is how we, our perception of reality is our map, what we think things to be. And these filters are literally intrinsically linked, that the map feeds back and changes the filters. So what's happened to us is that some information made it into our mind, because what happens is that stories usually bypass these filters. Okay, and this is a really important point, because the filters are usually conscious. So if somebody, well, they're an unconscious process, but literally when we're conscious, so if you're throwing facts at someone, they are usually banging up against the person's filters and producing cognitive dissonance, etc. But stories tend to bypass it. And this is why most people that are aware, they will tell you a story. They won't tell you a fact. They will tell you a story. Okay, they won't say, oh, I looked at blah, blah, blah. They will tell you a story about how the fact made it into their mind. So we'll come back to this, but it's a really key point. So then let's look at, and this is where it gets really interesting. So a metaphor example of a map. So obviously within the project, we talk about the Hotel of Knowledge, which is a map. It's a type of map. It's a map of what we know to be true. And the reason that we produced this metaphor, we did it intentionally, is that when we were talking to a lot of people, one of the biggest problems that we noticed is that most people that were aware were basically screaming information that was far outside the other person's awareness. Makes sense? It was just too complex. It was too beyond what they knew to be true. And as someone at the weekend said, it was too far out their comfort zone. There's a little bit of a stretch, and then when you go past the stretch, you hit cognitive dissonance. So we designed this metaphor to explain to people that if we imagine what we know here now, whether we've taken months or years to learn it, if we structured it in a hierarchical fashion, the lower levels of knowledge would be quite sort of small bits. And then as we went on further and further up the hotel, we would have higher and higher conclusions. If you try to tell someone one of those conclusions from the higher floors, you are almost guaranteed cognitive dissonance. You are guaranteed even more if that fact or conclusion differs from the one that they currently believe. That makes sense? So that's one of the things that if we avoid that, then that's going to, take out a big chunk of the problem. So Joe, let's look at his Hotel of Knowledge. So Joe believes there's a serious pandemic on, and he believes that the PCR test can be trusted. He believes that the media can be trusted and the government. He believes there's consensus, which funny enough is one of the biggest pillars to the narrative, is that most people think there's scientific consensus. Okay, and it's not actually the case. And they also believe that there's checks and balances. They believe there's enough different sort of organizations and government departments involved that there's oversight. Okay, and as we realize, and we know there isn't. So then his conclusion is that government's doing its best in a, even if it is or it isn't, a lot of people say, oh, well, they're just doing what they can under difficult circumstances. And then, of course, we have another thing that's, a certain drug they're telling us is not effective. Then we're told that certain other things are. And then, of course, we're told continuously by every media outlet in a different way, it's the only way. So you'll hear most people supporting the narrative saying it, they literally will use the words, it's our only way out. And it's because they've been told that story. So then Joe will summarize these conclusions. So the thing is, you can't push against any of those conclusions, because all that's going to happen is you're going to push back. What we're looking to do is to get this information in there. And the best way of doing that is via stories and questions. And obviously within that is to follow the high level map, which is, the link is on the website. So in fact, if we got this information into Joe's knowledge, into his map, his Hotel of Knowledge would look far different to it does now. The problem is that it's not making it past the filters. And the reason is that, you know, there's certain ways that people dismiss information, and most of the information that most people are presenting to people is being dismissed. So there's many ways that we can get around this. So there's one other point that I think is really important to understand, and that is when we have the hotel of knowledge of self-image. So how do we see ourselves? Okay, this is really important, which again, is just another map. So if Jane feels ignored, if she feels a lack of confidence, if she feels fear, if she feels a lack of skills, all of this is going to have her a self-image and not thinking she can't make a difference, not realizing how much of a difference she can make. If she doesn't feel that she has power, if she doesn't feel that she has authority, if she doesn't feel that it works, if she doesn't feel that there's a, what does that say? Yeah, people don't listen. She's going to have the thing, we're fighting a losing battle. That makes sense. So her hotel of knowledge is going to drive her conclusions. So we want to introduce, and this is one of the aspects of the project, is to show people to acquire the skills, the knowledge, and the mindset. This looking at the mindset. So we want her to feel skillful. We want her to feel confident. We want her to know that she can make a difference. Okay. And it really is, nothing is so, but thinking makes it so. Okay. When you see a confident person, think about confidence. It's an abstract term. It doesn't make any sense. It's only an opinion. Now, when someone says they have no confidence, I ask them if they're sure. Are you completely sure you have no confidence? Are you confident that you have no confidence? I said these things are fascinating, because when you start looking at self-image, you'll realize, where did we get these things from? We got these things from our schooling, because the last thing that an establishment wants is a free-thinking public that has a lot of confidence in itself. You can't control those types of people. So one of the things of the project is for us to take control of our own self-image and basically make it a powerful one. And that's what Tuesday night CFTs are about. Because the emotions will literally distort what we feel about ourselves. When the emotion changes, these pillars change. That makes sense? Okay, so that's a really key point. So now let's go a step further. How maps drive our behavior. So let's take that map and let's make it three-dimensional. Okay, so in effect, there's levels within our map. At the bottom level, you can see people's behavior and you can see the environment aware when they do things. This is not anything that has much use to change, because it's governed by the things above it, which are the invisible, which is our habits, our skill sets, which are our capabilities, our patterns, how we need to do things, language, etc. Go a level up, our values and our beliefs. If we, in fact, there was a couple of studies on this which were incredible. They studied a whole thousands and thousands of salespeople. They were trying to work out what were the skills that set the good ones apart from the average ones. Did you know what they found? Nothing. Nothing but one thing, the belief in themselves. That was what set them aside from the others. There was another study within a school where they gave a class an exam. They measured who came top. They told the teachers the two people that came bottom actually came top. Okay, they didn't tell the teachers or the students. The next semester, those two children were top, because the teachers treated them as though they were really good. They believed they were really good, and then they became really good. So it's really, it's not what we, you know, it's, we believe, we see what we believe. And of course, maps are not so much right or wrong as useful or not useful. Okay, so a lot of the maps here are really metaphors, and they're very powerful when you understand them. So if we look at that 3D view of the map, the ripple, what we see is that Jane now, that her purpose, or actually this can be considered our connection to spirit or our connection to our groups. This drives her identity, which in turn, how she sees herself produces her values and beliefs. Her values and beliefs produce what she can do, her skill sets and her habits. Her skill sets and her habits defines what she does. What she does really dictates where and when she does things or do things. Now, when a thought comes up, imagine dropping a tennis ball into a bath of water. And when we look at it from above, you get this ripple outwards. So the thought that comes up is going to ripple through the person's identity, through their beliefs, through their skill sets. The same thought in two different people is going to have two different outputs, depending on their belief systems. The story that really shows this is that this big shoe company sent 2 salesmen to India. And they come back a few weeks later and they go into the CEO's office, and the first one goes in and he says, "How was it?" And he goes, "Well, it's terrible. No one wears shoes." Okay. So he gets up, he leaves. The second one comes in and the CEO goes, "How was it?" He says, "Fantastic. No one wears shoes. We've got the whole market." Okay. And it's really how we see things. So many times when we're seeing problems and challenges, they are opportunities. The example is when someone comes up to us screaming at us at a march, they're far easier to talk to than the person that turns their back on you. Okay, because they want to engage. And if you talk to them in the right way within a few minutes, and someone from the weekend where I presented messaged me where he was at one of the roundabouts, a doctor stopped off, got out, started shouting at him, and he used this approach. And he said within 5 minutes, they were having a nice conversation. Okay. It's really the ones that have that energy, when you let them know you're on their side and you have questions, then, you know, and you're not rude back to them, that you'll get an apology and usually a conversation. So hopefully now we can see that when maps collide, it's literally two people's perspectives. It's not reality colliding. So you have Jane and you have Joe, and Jane's got her perspective, which you could say is like a pair of glasses. We're seeing everything through these glasses. And when you think about the 3D glasses, it's really fascinating how they work. What they do is that the left lens, I think, cuts out all red, and the right lens cuts out all blue. And then they put these colors into the screen. And because your one eye is seeing it and the other eye isn't, you then get binocular. So then you start to see things in 3D on a 2D screen. So then what we've got is that each person is literally looking at the event or the information through their lens, through their very specific, unique lens. And what most of us do is we focus on the event or the info. Okay. And if we zoom out, and that's once you get the maps really well and the understanding really well, then that's a really good place to focus. But first, we need to focus on our map to make sure that we're not angry, agitated, all the emotions when we're talking to someone, because that holds us back. Once we clear our emotions, once we get our information, our belief systems really clear, then we can really look at Joe's and present the information in such a way that we don't hit up against the filters. And once you talk to enough people, you generally know the things that people believe that aren't true, and then you can develop remedies. Makes sense? And then you have information ready. And the more and more we do this, the more sound and the better we're going to get at doing it. So we've really only scratched on the surface of mapping out the other person's belief systems. So really for us, it's reflection and mindset management. And then for the other person, it's deep listening and relating. So it's really knowing where they're coming from and really knowing what we can say. So then so if we looked at Joe, how was Joe's map influenced? So we've had a look at this before. So we've got Joe's perception, his map. Okay, and then you've got the mind space document, which is the government document working out how to manipulate people. So they know how to present information. It's a very interesting document. I was fortunate, actually, Catherine sent it to me, and it was one of the real turning points in really getting to knowledge. There's the 7 laws of influence. You've got the language models. And the next one is actually can be really, really positive. The NLP can be used for great things. In the wrong hands, like any powerful tool, can be used for bad things. We've got a list of miscellaneous techniques that are used. We've got the 5 rules of propaganda. So you've effectively got the kitchen sink of influence thrown at Joe's map. okay? And Joe is effectively living Truman's life, the Truman Show. And all of these models on the right, there's an interview on the website that we did with Jamie from the Activist Toolbox, and we look at each of those and how you can basically protect yourself, but also there's many ways that these can be used ethically, okay? And that's the really key point, that it's not about coercing people, and a lot of them are natural processes that have been hijacked. So for instance, the authority process. It makes sense that if you're making a decision to consult someone that is an expert in that subject. That makes sense, and that always has made sense. The way it's being manipulated now is they present an expert and they say he's the only expert, and they say that he's telling the truth. We've learned that that isn't always the case, so we don't fall for the authority principle. That makes sense. So these are the things. There's things like the commitment principle. So the commitment principle is very powerful. When I'm talking to someone, I want them to commit to being open and honest. So I'll ask them. Once they commit to it, they've basically committed to it, and they're much more likely to be open and honest. Makes sense? So they're ethical ways that they can be used. So let's just quickly touch on how emotions distort the maps and perception. So we've got a few stories that are very interesting. So each of these circles represent, so I worked with a rugby player in Sydney, and each of these circles represent a game that he played. The first 6 games, he played fantastic. The 7th game, he had a shocker, okay? And the 8th and 9th were okay. But because there was so much emotion wrapped up in that game, it literally overshadowed all the other games. That makes sense? It literally, it's almost that the negative emotions pump up something to appear much more important than it is. And it has many other ways that it distorts it. But what we did was, we used EFT and we focused on that game, and then it drifted into the background, and then he got his confidence back. Does that make sense? Because it's really how these things in the back of our mind, and as you're talking to someone, out of their awareness, they are building a representation, whether it be pictures and objects of what you're describing. And another thing is that the mind updates itself so quickly that people aren't aware that they even had a problem. So I had one of the AFL players come in. He had missed a goal. Okay, so Aussie rules football. He had a goal to win a match. He missed it, lost his confidence. Okay, we worked on that. Took 7 minutes. Confidence come back. But one of the ones that was really shocking was when there was a lady. She was known as actually I won't say what she's known as, but she was very well known within Sydney, and she had asked for a couple of sessions. I visited her house, and going up in the lift and all these things, and we're sitting down, and she describes what she wants to work on, and she's having problems in her relationship. So I asked her the question. So a lot of the thing is what's gone on in the past. So I asked her if there was any relationships from the past that still bothered her, and then she told me of one of her ex-boyfriends from 10 years ago. And I said to her, when you think about him, how uncomfortable do you feel on a scale of 1 to 10? She said 10. I have absolute rage. 15 minutes later, that 10 is now 0. I said to her, see, the technique worked. She said, oh no, it was 10 years ago. It doesn't matter now. She literally couldn't remember that 15 minutes ago, she felt that much anger, because our perception updates in real time. So I learned from that was to make people write it down before we did it, so I could get paid, because they effectively don't realize that's the power of perception. Is it because it changes from moment to moment? A lot of people don't have enough consciousness to remember what it was like even 15 minutes previously. And because they've moved people's perception so gradually, people have now developed certain views that some people could describe as fascist, but they're not aware. They've thought that they've believed the same things all the time. So stories alter the map, and it's really one of the most powerful ways to do so. And of course, the stories I'm describing now will be altering your maps, and for the positive, because they're positive stories. So effectively, information comes in from a person, it's filtered and edited, and then it makes it into the map back and forth. But if you don't know the filters and the editing, and you're not able to bypass those or to navigate the resistance, then you never get through to someone. Makes sense? So hopefully it's a bit clearer now, because I think this presentation today really needs to be one of the first that people watch and then start to learn all the things after. So it was Jerome Bruner, who was a cognitive psychologist from the 60s, and he'd done a load of studies in telling someone a fact and then separately telling them that same fact but in a story. And he found that the stories were 22 times more powerful to land an idea. Now, there's been some debate whether it's only 6 or 7 times more powerful. Okay, but think about that. Is it 700% better, or is it 2000? I mean, it's better. It's a lot better. Okay, so in summary, and I'm well aware that, you know, this literally is, you know, how we work in 30 minutes, which is, you know, incredible to expect someone to understand this first time round, but it's so important. And perception dictates people's view of reality. They don't interact with reality. We interact with the perception of reality. And that's why so many narratives don't care what the facts are. They know how to change people's perception, and they spend the time there. Influence factors are keys for what a thing means. So all the body of work that we have on all the influence factors, if you understand those, you can start to use them for good. Our perceptions are collections of maps and lenses, literally how we see the world. And within the project, we try to provide a lot of lenses and maps in order to see things, you know, in a more effective way. Our filters edit the information and dictates what makes it into our maps. And largely, really, stories are very powerful for altering maps. In fact, if you watch Linda Cron's TED Talk on YouTube, which is an absolute must, they now, from certain psychology studies, think that the civil rights movement was triggered by To Kill a Mockingbird. It's that stories define us. And when you think about our story of what's going on, that defines us. And Plato said, he who tells the stories rule society. For that reason, they are dictating perception. And lastly, questions have a huge role, but we're going to have to explore that another time, because that is, you know, that could be done. That could be a week presentation on questions. Currently, the Zoom presentations on the course are free, and we'd like to keep it that way. We may do nominal fees for certain workshops, but we want to get this information out to everyone as widely as possible. If you have benefited and would like to donate, then please visit this link at reachingpeople.website /donation. For videos and information, visit reachingpeople.website or info@reachingpeople.website. Thank you.